How do we maximize health span?
We call them the 4 pillars of Healthspan: eat, move, sleep, and connect. When you optimize those lifestyle factors, you are in fact slowing the rate at which you are aging.
The connection, does that encompass having the pets as well?
Absolutely. We also grieve for them very much like we do when we lose people. So when you asked me that question, I paused for a minute because we lost our German Shepherd about 6 months ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh my God. I'm tearing up a little bit now.
There's a lot of men that might be getting some tea therapy from the gym. What are your thoughts on tea supplementation for men?
So there's good reason to believe that testosterone supplementation is a win. The flip side of that is almost anybody can get testosterone.
And it's interesting because estrogen isn't given out like that.
In mice, there's this thing called heterochronic parabiosis. What that means is you surgically connect a young mouse to an old mouse. What you see when you do that is very interesting. The old mouse gets healthier and the young mouse gets sicker.
So they're sharing a circulatory system?
Yep.
Okay.
It's not yet conclusive, but a growing body of data for people who have mild cognitive impairment on the road to dementia, that therapeutic plasma exchange can slow that progression. I had this light bulb moment. I'm like, oh my God, I want my dog to live 20% longer. And so I set out to try to create a clinical trial of rapamycin in dogs. And now we have 50,000 plus dog longitudinal study of aging.
It's in the very early stages at the minute.
The first study, we saw evidence for improvements in heart function, and owners self-reported that their dogs were more active.
Welcome back to the Laura Dowling Experience. Today's guest is a very interesting man, Dr. Matt Kaeberlein.
Kaeberlein, yeah.
Oh, I got it right. A global leader in aging science. He believes aging isn't just inevitable, it's modifiable. From genes to dogs to humans, he's on a mission to help us all live longer, healthier lives. So let's dive in. Matt, what a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Will you explain to people what you do?
Well, that's a complicated question. So I would say what my career has really been focused on is understanding what are the biological mechanisms of aging. And the reason why I decided to start studying that as a graduate student is because aging is the greatest risk factor for almost every major functional decline and disease that affects people and animals. And so if we can understand that biology, we can modify it in a way that slows the onset and progression of all those functional declines and diseases. So it's really, I believe, the most effective way to improve health for people. And I'm very interested in companion animals, dogs and cats, and really any other animal that people care about. So that's what I do. Now, my day job has sort of changed. I was in academia for 20 plus years, and now I am the CEO of a company called Optisan. And that's a combination of two words, optimal and healthspan. You just put them together, Optisan. And our goal, we're really a healthcare technology company. Our goal is to enable science-based proactive healthcare for as many people as possible. And so we want to take the principles of the science of aging and combine that with the best-in-class tools that are available today in terms of evidence-based preventative healthcare to bring that to as many people as we can.
There's been lots of talk over the last number of years about preventative medicine, longevity. The likes of Peter Attia would spring to mind in terms of one of the doctors that really was leading that conversation. Yeah. I know longevity, and I suppose most people that would listen to what we're talking about today, people would consider longevity to be living longer and healthier.
Yeah.
Is that basically what longevity means?
I think that's right. I think it's important to say that term longevity has grown in popularity just massively over the last few years. And so I think it really depends on who you're talking to, what people mean by that word. When I think about longevity, because of my background, again, I've been doing the science of longevity for 25 years now. I immediately go to, those fundamental mechanisms of aging. But I think longevity is bigger than that because there are other things that can impact quality and quantity of life. I would agree with you completely, though, that I don't think anybody's really interested in living longer if it's very low quality life. Probably what we're more interested in, even if we don't live longer, is maximizing those healthy years of life. And so that's where this concept of healthspan comes in. So healthspan really refers to the period of life that's spent in good health, high quality life, where you maintain function and basically you can do what you want to do. You feel good about the quality of your life. And so then there's this question of, does Healthspan always track with lifespan? And I think that's really one of the fundamental questions that we in the field need to address, because I think you could make the argument that for many people today, certainly Healthspan does not track with lifespan. More than half the population, at least in the United States, spends 20 to 30 years with at least one, often more than one chronic disease. And I'm not saying that having a chronic disease means that you have no health span, but it certainly means that your health isn't as good as it could be. So a lot of what I think about and what I'm working on is really how do we push those diseases of aging back as far as we can, maximize health span. Certainly we would want to increase lifespan as well, but really it's probably more about maximizing health span than it is maximizing lifespan.
And how do we maximize health span?
Yeah. So I would say it's not going to surprise anyone. The levers that have the biggest impact for the most people are really based around lifestyle. And so there are lots of ways you can partition out the most important lifestyle factors. We think of 4 pillars. We call them the 4 pillars of health span. Eat, which is nutrition. Move, which is exercise. Sleep, which is sleep. And connect, which is, I think, the one that the scientists in the field probably don't talk about enough. Connect encompasses both what many people would call mindfulness, but also human connection, human relationships. I think those relationships are so important to quality of life, and we know that they impact the biology of aging. That's the other thing I would say about these lifestyle factors: eat, move, sleep, connect. The reason why optimizing those affects not just one age-related disease, but essentially all age-related diseases is because when you optimize those lifestyle factors, you are in fact slowing the rate at which you are aging. And the outcome is your health span is maximized. So those are the things where I think most people can get the biggest bang for the buck. And then we can get outside of lifestyle, and then it gets murky. Then there's this whole gray area. And that's, I think, obviously where the science is at right now. Among all of the things that people are talking about, and then a lot of things people don't know about yet, what are the approaches we can take in addition to lifestyle? I don't want to say at the expense of lifestyle. We don't have anything yet where you can basically do whatever you want and have a magic pill. But I think there are some things we can do that on top of lifestyle can have further benefits, can have added benefits.
When you talk about connection, do you mean connection as well as human connection? Because obviously you're interested in companion animals. Yeah. Is the connection, does that encompass having the pets as well?
Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely... So first of all, what do I believe? Absolutely. I think our companion animals, for many people, we consider our companion animals to be part of our family. We feel very much about our companion animals the way we feel about our children.
Do you have animals?
I have had dogs my entire life. I also like cats. I've had cats, but I'm really a dog person.
So am I. I'm a boxer. He's literally like a toddler.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And what I was going to say is we also grieve for them very much like we do when we lose people. So when you asked me that question, I paused for a minute because we are now between dogs. We lost our German Shepherd about 6 months ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh my God. I mean, all of my companion animals have been special, but there have been a couple that are more special than the others, I would say. And he was just an amazing companion. And it was, I mean, I'm tearing up a little bit now just thinking about it still.
See that.
So yes, I mean, I think that our connection to our companion animals is very much a part of that connect pillar. And there's good science to support that. There's good science showing that when people interact with their companion animals, that has a positive impact physiologically on both the human and the animal. So there's no question in my mind that companion animals can play an important role there.
Okay. So you spoke about other things that we can do as humans to help with our longevity, our health span, our lifespan, apart from the diet, the exercise, the sleep, and the connection.
Yeah.
So what does that look like?
Yeah. So there I would say now we have to be clear that there's probably not a lot that works for everyone. And there probably aren't very many things that have large effects. So again, I kind of think about what are the big levers, and then I would put those lifestyle factors there. And then there are things that are in the gray area. So before we started filming, we talked a little bit about hormones. I think hormones are something that would fall into that bucket where for a lot of people, maybe not for everyone, but for a lot of people, hormone therapy can have a big impact on health span. The impact on lifespan is less clear, and there are reasons for that. I think we don't know at this point whether or not hormone therapy in men or women actually slows the biological aging process, but I think there's very clear evidence that for some people, hormone therapy can have a profound positive impact on health span.
Well, particularly, I know that the menopause conversation has really come to the fore in the last number of years. We discussed already, I've discussed it on numerous podcasts here, the WHI study came out, HRT prescribing and taking fell off a cliff. An entire generation of women did without. And a lot of women now are asking for HRT and going to their doctor, and they're being put on it with the idea, I suppose, that they are improving their health, their cardiovascular health, their bone health, without a doubt. That's a given. But even now there's talk about it may reduce the risk of dementia, etc. But as you said, we don't have the exact science or evidence for that yet, do we not?
So now I think we have to talk about probabilities. And I know people don't like probabilities, but that's the world of science, right?
Yeah.
So nobody legitimate would tell you that there is 100% chance that hormone therapy is going to increase your lifespan or improve your health span. But I think when you look at the data as a whole, the probabilities suggest that it is very likely for most women, when done responsibly, and I think that's an important caveat, and we can talk about why that's important, hormone therapy is likely to have significant benefits in all the domains that you talked about: bone density, cognitive function, cardiovascular, and even in many cases, metabolic health. And again, part of the challenge is because of the history here where, hormone therapy was fairly common, and then the WHI came out and it fell off a cliff, and then there was basically no research for a long period of time. Now that hormone therapy is starting to come back, and I'm glad it is, I think it should, it's still not as widely utilized, in my opinion, as it should be. There are a lot of questions. And so there's a lot of now figuring out what's the right time to start therapy, what's the right ratios of the different hormones involved, when to add testosterone, when not to add testosterone. So I think it's a very individual thing, but I feel like there still is a lot of research that needs to be done to really help doctors understand, what is the best way to approach this. Right now, it seems like there are lots of doctors, as you said, who have taken an interest in this topic, as they should. But because there was a generation of doctors that weren't trained in hormone therapy, there's a lot of guessing going on right now. And what we need is enough data to start, having clear quality guidelines so that there isn't as much guessing.
And there's an argument also for it that, say, 100 years ago, say, women did not live as long. So therefore, the amount of women that were living post-menopausally, so say on average after the age of 51, definitely wasn't as many as there are today. And as a result now, we have a lot of women, they could be living a third of their lives post-menopausally. So them doing that without the hormones that their bodies have been used to since they hit puberty can be quite catastrophic for a lot of these ladies. But as you said, we definitely need more research. But I suppose it's whether or not the research will be done and the cost of the research. I'd say a lot of it will be observational studies too.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's
going to take some time. Yeah. And I mean, this is a challenge with studying anything that is age-related in humans as opposed to in animal models, is because humans live so long, it takes a long time to do these studies.
Yeah.
So you're right. I think it needs to be a very individual question when we're talking about hormone therapy for both men and women. I think right now, we don't have much data one way or the other as to whether, say a woman who starts hormone therapy in perimenopause, stays on for 10 years, should then come off or stay on for the rest of her life. I just don't think we have enough data to know one way or the other. And so it probably needs to be guided by symptomology. How does she feel? Again, a lot of this is about quality of life. And I know many women who are on hormone therapy and have had significant improvements in their quality of life. And so if she comes off of hormones and suddenly starts developing symptoms that are detracting from her quality of life, by all means, stay on them. The risk is probably relatively small, but again, we have to be honest, we don't have a large enough data set to really know. One thing I do think is important in this hormone discussion, so with the WHI study, the big scare was around breast cancer, right? And it was a relatively small, but in the way the analysis was done, statistically significant increase. And so I think most people looking back now in hindsight will say that's probably not even real, or it was the type of hormones that were used and those aren't being used anymore, or the age that the women started hormone therapy. All of those are non-standard today. But let's just accept that risk is real. This is where I'm sort of boggles my mind that the medical community didn't step up and get this right earlier. Even if that small increased risk of cancer was real, the benefits in terms of all these things we already talked about, I would argue far outweigh that small increase in risk. But our traditional healthcare is so risk averse that any slight increased risk of doing something is worse than the cost of doing nothing in most cases. And I just don't think there's ever, in this case, really been a careful, rational risk-reward analysis.
Yeah, no, I agree. Testosterone for men, that is a nuanced conversation also.
Yeah.
There's a lot of men that might be getting some T therapy from the gym. There's some that are getting it from their GPs. What are your thoughts on T supplementation for men?
Yeah, so I'll tell you the general, and then I'll tell you the personal, okay? So the general is that there's no doubt that men don't go through menopause like women do, but most men do experience a decline in testosterone with age. And in some men, it's very precipitous, and the age of onset is much more variable than it is in women. But there is something kind of like a menopausal hormonal transition in men. It's just much more variable and over a much longer period of time. And certainly, many men who have clinical deficiencies in testosterone experience symptoms from those deficiencies, and they can be, quality of life, energy, mood, libido, and they can also be significant health challenges. Bone density, again, in men can be a problem. Loss of muscle mass leading to metabolic disturbances, adverse lipid profiles, all can be tied back to changes in hormones. So in testosterone in particular. So there's good reason to believe that testosterone supplementation in those men is a win in terms of quality of life and probably quantity of life if they're at higher risk for diseases that might kill them. The flip side of that is because the regulation of testosterone has sort of backed off, at least in the United States. I'm not sure if it's the same in Ireland, but almost anybody can get testosterone now. You can go online. You basically say, I'm feeling fatigued and I'm having depression, and you can get prescribed testosterone.
You can get it in... It's not legally.
Well, then you can also get it illegally. Yes,
yeah,
right.
Yeah, so you can, apparently you can get it in gyms and everything. It's like rampant, okay?
Sure.
And it's interesting because estrogen isn't given out like that, But anyway.
Yeah, there is a little bit of bro stuff going on here.
Exactly. So.
But obviously it's irresponsible if people are trading this stuff at the gym. But look, also, I was young and stupid once. I see why that happens. I'm not condoning it. I see why that happens. I think, it might be a little bit outside the scope. The concerns about testosterone, I think, are very different in young men versus middle-aged men, right? Mm-hmm. So young men, if you don't know what you're doing, you can temporarily to permanently shut down endogenous testosterone production, and you will never be able to have kids, and you will be taking testosterone for the rest of your life, potentially. So I think a lot of times young men want the energy and musculature and libido effects of mega dosing, in some cases, testosterone without recognizing the potential long-term consequences. And also, you really better trust the person who's shooting you up in the gym or giving you that vial, because how do you really know what's in there would be my other thought. But I also would say, I feel like the plethora of tea shops that are out there now where there are licensed physicians who are just handing this stuff out like candy, that's also a bit irresponsible, in part because often they don't actually do the labs to confirm that the man is in fact testosterone deficient, and they don't follow up to make sure that they've got the dose within the range that you're typically shooting for. And why would you want to be in the range? Well, you want to be in the range so you alleviate the symptoms and you don't get the side effects as much as possible. So I just feel like it's being done a bit irresponsibly. I think we don't know what the long-term consequences of that will be, but we're going to find out because we're doing this human experiment. So having said that, I have a personal story, and I've just recently shared this, and in part it's because I think a lot of men go through a similar process that I went through. So I won't bore you with the whole thing. We actually have an episode on the Optisan podcast coming out probably next week, where I talk through this actually with the doctor who helped get me on the right track. Okay. But probably in my early to mid 40s, I started experiencing symptoms of testosterone deficiency. I didn't really connect it until, I was probably in my late 40s, and I went to my primary care doc. It took a while to convince him to even do a test. When he did what a lot of primary care docs do, which is only measured total testosterone. It was low, but within the normal range. He's like, you're fine, go home. So that's a common mistake because total testosterone is almost completely non-informative. I guess maybe if you're at the very high end or above the high end of normal, that you're probably not deficient, but you really need to measure a bunch of other markers. And so I had another friend who was going through the sort of same process with testosterone deficiency, had a bunch of the symptomology, and he did it on his own by becoming educated and finding a way to get the blood tests. There are now a lot of direct-to-consumer blood test companies out there. This was in the early days. And so he got tested and was able to diagnose himself. He was like, hey, you should do this. And so I did. And so when I got my results back, it was very clear that I had something called primary hypogonadism, which basically means that my testicles aren't able to produce enough testosterone. And there are clear blood biomarkers that will tell you that. And we're happy to talk about it if you think that's of interest, but it's pretty easy to know. It's pretty easy to diagnose that. In fact, ChatGPT will do it for you if you have the right markers. So then I went down the path of, do I really want to start testosterone therapy? You know, recognizing it's something that in a man, you're going to probably have to do for the rest of your life, because once you start, you will shut down your endogenous. So I wasn't at zero, obviously. You will shut down your endogenous testosterone. And so there was about a 2 to 3 year period where I tried everything that I could think of, what I could find on the internet to raise testosterone endogenously, exercise, diet, cut way back on the alcohol, even tried some supplements. Nothing really worked. And so then I got to the point where I was like, okay, you know, I tried everything I could, and I made one mistake. I was a little leery of doing the injections I didn't have to do it every day, but a couple times a week, which in hindsight, again, I'm like, why was I such a baby? But I was a little nervous about it. So I tried the oral form, which is called Jatenzo. It had a whole bunch of side effects. Yeah. Mostly it was the water retention was the big one for me. And then the doc that I've got now, he's a friend of mine as well. It's great to have friends who are really good docs. Was like, look, he was like, stop being a baby. I'll show you how to inject it. It's not a big deal. We'll get you on the right dose. We'll get you taken care of. And he did. And it's been a game changer. So that's, for me personally, I would say outside of lifestyle, that's probably the one thing there's a couple of things. That's one of the things that has had the biggest impact on my health. Okay. So I think for some men, it's hugely powerful.
And do you change your dose year on year? Have you needed to increase it as you've got older?
Well, I've only been on testosterone for less than a year.
Oh, okay.
Now. Yeah. So it's pretty early.
Okay.
I do regular blood tests. So I do my blood tests pretty typically quarterly. And I've been on the current regimen for probably 4 or 5 months now that we got it dialed in. So I'll keep monitoring for sure. I really think the symptoms is if you're paying attention, the symptoms also will tell you kind of where you're at.
So what were your symptoms?
I mean, definitely looking back, you know, a lot lower energy than I had, a lot of fatigue, pretty dramatic drop in libido and body composition. I have done resistance training off and on my entire adult life, and definitely noticed that my strength, it was harder to maintain my strength. And also it was harder to maintain my muscle mass. I mean, I was soft. I don't know how else to say it. Right. Yeah. And all of those things are pretty characteristic symptoms of low testosterone. Do
you know what kind of percentage there is of males that would need the testosterone therapy? Because we know that there's give or take, you could say there's probably a 1% drop every year in testosterone when a man does reach a certain age, usually late 30s, early 40s. But I suppose we don't even know how many men might benefit from testosterone therapy because the studies aren't there. Is that right?
That's right. And again, I think it's really hard even to measure what you mean by benefit. So you said need. I think, first of all, there are probably some men who need it for health reasons. I don't know if I needed it. Like, I don't know. I mean, it's possible that my risk of developing some age-related disease and dying was higher because I wasn't on testosterone. But I can definitely say my quality of life is much better now. So I guess it depends on what you mean by need. Yeah. But I would say in terms of the men who would get significant symptomatic improvement, where their quality of life would be dramatically improved, I don't know what the percentage is. My intuition is it's a lot higher than is typically thought. I think like with women, with the Women's Health Initiative, it's really interesting because even though it's pretty easy now to get testosterone, you don't have to really jump through any hoops. You can just go online and get it. I know a lot of men who are very nervous about starting testosterone. I was. Like, it took me 3 years to get over that, from the point where I knew that I probably needed it or should take it. I shouldn't use that word need, to when I actually decided to. There was a psychological component there to, first of all, accepting that this is real. Like, I think there is still a stigma associated, which is dumb. I mean, it's just biology. And then that it's something I would have to do for the rest of my life was something that I really had to kind of work through, try the alternatives. And so I know a lot of men. And then there is this, I think, misconception that testosterone is dangerous. Like, I would say we don't know for sure what the health benefits and health risks over 30, 40 years are. And I plan to be on testosterone for 30, 40, 50 years, like maybe more. If I do my job, maybe more, right?
Okay, yeah.
So we don't know what the health risks are over that time frame. My intuition is that if anything, it's going to be a net positive for longevity, certainly for Healthspan, but for longevity. But I don't know that because we don't have the data. Okay. And there are some people who will say testosterone accelerates aging. Again, there's no real data to support that. The one thing is so funny. The one thing that the people who say, well, testosterone is going to make you accelerate your aging. And I'm like, well, why do you believe that? And like, well, eunuchs live longer. Like, well, number one, that may or may not be true. There is some data out there, but it's not great data. Number two, those guys are castrated. That's a completely different physiological situation. And eunuchs live very different lives from the average person. So I really wouldn't draw too many conclusions from that.
Also,
but
there aren't very many of them, I'm assuming, that you could actually extrapolate out.
I think it's historical data.
Yeah.
So my response to those guys is sort of like, well, if you really believe that, you can go make yourself a eunuch.
Okay. Fair enough, exactly. So we've discussed hormones and how they might help with longevity. What are the other modifiable factors that we can...
Some of them are kind of obvious. So I sort of put alcohol and when that falls under lifestyle, I sort of put that in the eat category, but alcohol is a big sort of outlier as well. Alcohol is interesting. I'm not one of those people who says don't ever drink. I still drink periodically. I used to drink a lot, and I think that's one of the biggest things I've done personally for my health. But
by a lot, what do you mean now? Because a lot to you might be...
Well, I mean, I think during the pandemic, I was probably drinking every day, multiple drinks a day.
Okay.
So way more than I should have been.
Yeah. Okay.
And way more than what, the guidelines for moderate consumption of alcohol are. So this is where I was going, which is that, if you look at the all-cause mortality data, it's pretty clear. And we now have some epidemiologists arguing against this, but they're like trying to change the interpretation of the data. The data are clear. If you take people who never drink and then you start going with increasing alcohol consumption, the mortality rate, the risk of dying goes down for a little bit. So about 1 drink a day, and we're talking international units, not American-sized drinks. I don't know how the drinks are probably big in Ireland too. Yeah, we're talking international-sized drinks. 1 drink a day for women, 1 to 2 for men. There's a little drop in all-cause mortality, so your risk of dying goes down a little bit, but then it rapidly goes up. And so that's, I think, the real question. We don't know why. We could speculate. I think it's probably both a combination of physiological effects of a low amount of alcohol, and when done properly, you're drinking that moderate alcohol in a social setting with other human beings. And we talked about the connect.
Yeah, because I suppose the whole argument for the blue zone areas, which is, I suppose you take France or Italy and they're eating the Mediterranean diet, but they also drink wine, but then they're also walking up hills and they're living together in a community where I'm going to Sicily tomorrow for my holiday.
Hey, fantastic.
And I was there last year, and literally I go out for a run at 6 a.m. and there would be a bunch of old men, generally old men, sitting on the walls of the beachfront together at 6 a.m, drinking espressos and chatting. And that is the connectivity that you're talking about, I suppose. So you can't just take one issue like alcohol and say, oh, well, look, the blue zones are all drinking their heads off, therefore it's okay. I
would agree with that. I think the studies that have done this well aren't only looking in blue zones. They're controlling for as many of the confounding variables as you can. And in humans are a mess, right? For lots of reasons, but it's really hard to control everything. But this is showing up in study after study after study. I think it's pretty believable that there is an effect of alcohol that's hard to pin down to one thing, like where the people who drink a lot live. But I think the other thing that's important to say is for many people, and I'd put myself in that category, it can be a challenge to limit yourself to one international drink when you're out with friends, right? And so
100%, I'm in that category too.
So I think that's where, we do want to be cautious not to say you should drink one drink a day for your health. I think in general, it's better for most people to cut the alcohol out except on special occasions. And even then, don't have 5, 6, 7 drinks at one time.
I suppose drinking has changed over a number of years as well. Particularly in Ireland, say, for instance, I remember years ago when I was growing up, my mum would have maybe had one vodka and Coke, like when her sister came down to visit, right? Once every few months, they would have had one or two and that would have been it. But nowadays, women, there's wine o'clock. We have wine at home. We can drink wine with the dinner. We can drink wine. We go out more with our friends. We have more independence. We have more money. So I have spoken to other people before about the fact that women are consuming more alcohol than they ever did.
Yeah.
And the effects this can have on things like, for instance, breast cancer. Like we talk about HRT and breast cancer, sure, alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely.
Increases the risk too.
You're right. And the only thing I would say, and this isn't countering that, I think it's useful for people to kind of put things in context though, which is that, you could make the same thing about the kinds of food most people eat, right? So that's why alcohol is sort of its own lifestyle factor, but it falls in that lifestyle bucket. And I really don't know what the relative impact on health is from if you have 3 drinks a day versus you eat fast food once a day versus you're completely sedentary. Like all of those things are bad news, right? And so you should try to avoid them. But I also don't want to make people focus so much on the alcohol that they don't pay attention to these other things, which are also really, really important. So anyways, that's again, kind of an obvious one, but it's one a lot of people don't really think about the same way. The same thing with exposures, environmental exposures. You could also put that under lifestyle. There are a lot of environmental exposures that can impact your long-term health. Smoking's one, obvious one, but pollution, toxic metals. So this is one of the things I think a lot of people aren't aware of, especially if you're trying to be healthy and you're eating seafood 5 times a week. Depending on the kind of seafood you're eating, you can actually get fairly high levels of mercury in your blood. So what do you do about that? Do you stop eating seafood? No, but you can get a mercury blood test once every 6 months. And if your mercury is getting up there, you can back off. So being aware of those kinds of things, I think, is a useful approach people can take.
How else can people avoid taking in heavy metals? Because I think there's an awful lot of talk of that in the States. I don't think it's quite hit here yet.
Well, I think oftentimes you don't know. So outside of seafood, your exposures to heavy metals often come from your drinking water, depending on the kind of pipes in your house or where you work. And then people might be like, well, maybe I should just drink bottled water. And then we got the microplastics, right? So there's that. We can talk about microplastics too. I think that's a really interesting topic. But what I would say is that's why getting a blood test, maybe once a year, it's not super expensive to get a blood test that includes multiple heavy metals. And then you can just find out. Most people probably you're going to find out that you don't have high levels. Great. You don't have to worry about your drinking water. But if you do, you want to know that, number one, and then you want to figure out where it's coming from and get it taken care of. So that's why I think it's just better if you can measure it. Like to me, it's kind of obvious, but our healthcare system has not yet caught on to this idea. So oftentimes people have to do it out of pocket. And again, I don't know in Ireland. In the United States, there are several companies now where you can order blood tests over the internet. They have a doctor that will sign off on it. And then you can just go to a clinic and they'll draw your blood and you'll get your test results. So if that's available in Ireland, then I kind of recommend that people do that along with a moderately comprehensive blood panel. And I'm happy to send that to you if you want to put it in show notes or whatever.
Yeah, no, do, because I don't think that's a widespread thing in Ireland. I'm sure there are companies that do it. But
yeah, it's very powerful. I mean, knowledge is power. And I think you want to have a doctor who will help you interpret, although I'm not suggesting that ChatGPT is a doctor yet. It's pretty good. So I mean, I do think most people can take their blood work and put it into ChatGPT and it will give them recommendations on where there might be problems. Then you definitely want to go to a doctor if there are problems. You don't want to self-diagnose only from ChatGPT. That's, I think, where the challenge is right now. At least in the United States, it's really easy to get blood work. In fact, there are big companies now who have raised hundreds of millions of dollars just to sell blood work to people. The problem is they don't pair it with an actual medical recommendation. So they're giving all these people all this information, freaking them out, and then no information on what to do about it. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between the direct-to-consumer selling and the actual practice of medicine. And
maybe that's a new business idea, Matt.
it's a terrible business. Well, I mean, again, you can make money off of it. I'll put it that way. I struggle a bit with the whole direct-to-consumer industry in the healthcare space because it feels like the incentives are very often aligned to doing things that are maybe not really helping people. Okay. Just because of the regulatory environment. And this is an example of that. The reason why these companies don't practice medicine, they'll sell you the blood test, but they won't practice medicine, is because of the regulatory environment. It makes it so hard to practice medicine. It's expensive and you have to have a license in that state and you'll probably get sued. So it's not that the companies are doing anything wrong. I think the system, unfortunately, is such that it makes it really hard to do it right.
Okay. So is it that heavy metals, they affect the cells on a level that increases aging? Or
I don't know if it accelerates aging, but it definitely, mercury in particular, can cause a lot of problems, including neuronal related problems. So inability to think, a lot of pain, so neuropathic pain. And eventually, it will kill you if you have mercury poisoning that gets too high. The heavy metals are things that our bodies are adapted to having at low levels, but once they get outside of those levels, our bodies aren't able to clear them. And so they end up, basically from a biochemical perspective, causing all sorts of chemical reactions to go wrong. And I don't know why neurons seem to be particularly sensitive. Might have to do with reactive oxygen species, but it's not only neurons that are being affected. So one of the challenges, though, is that the symptomology is often quite broad, meaning it's often very hard just from symptoms to say, oh, you've got cadmium poisoning or mercury poisoning or whatever, which again is why I think measuring is the right place to start. And, if you don't have any exposures, great. You probably don't need to measure again for a couple of years. But if you're living somewhere where you are exposed, you want to know that.
Microplastics.
Yeah, microplastics are super interesting. So they're obviously getting a lot of attention now. I would say we simply don't know at this point how dangerous they are in terms of long-term health consequences. Certainly some people who are at the extremes in terms of their microplastics levels, and I don't think we really know why those people are at the extremes in most cases. Some things have been attributed that are potentially very concerning to microplastics. But I think for the average person, I feel like the fear has gotten far ahead of the data at this point. And
how do you know you have high microplastic levels in your system, though? Usually
it's a post-symptomology. You can get a test now, but historically, I don't think it's very new that it's even been something that people measured, right?
Okay.
So I think the data are that after the fact, people have gone back and measured in autopsies microplastic levels, and they can correlate it to things like plaque burden and things like that. And then
in placentas as well, they're measuring placentas.
They're there,
and ovaries as well. They're saying they found, I don't know, I saw a study there recently that said they actually found microplastics in ovaries.
Yeah. So I don't think it should surprise anyone that microplastics are probably in every tissue in our body. I think the question is, at the levels that they're present, what damage are they causing? And that's where I think a lot of times we really don't know. It makes headlines because people are thinking, oh my God, my body's full of microplastics. The reality is most of us are doing okay. I'm not trying to minimize the impact. I would just say we don't know what the impact is. I think that's why I say I think the fear has gotten ahead of the reality to some extent. Having said that, I also think that taking steps to reduce your exposure to microplastics is just logical, right? So probably the one thing that most people can do if you haven't already is, as much as possible, stop drinking bottled water. You can get a test. I don't know how good the tests are. So I mentioned before we started filming that I recently did Therapeutic Plasma Exchange.
You might want to explain to people what that is.
Yeah. So Therapeutic Plasma Exchange, and I would put that, so we haven't yet talked about the next level down, the gray area, what might work. I'd put Therapeutic Plasma Exchange there. So Therapeutic Plasma Exchange in its simplest form is where you basically have an IV in each arm. One arm, the plasma's coming out. There's a device that has a centrifuge in it that spins the cells out. Then the plasma gets collected. The cells, your blood cells, are then resuspended in saline with a little bit of a protein called albumin, and then that comes back in the other arm. So that's basically to balance out all of the protein that's been taken out of your blood. So the albumin goes in with saline, and basically they take out, I think it's about 75 to 80% of your plasma, and it gets collected in a big bag that kind of hangs up there. And the reason for doing that, there's a couple of reasons. One is, in mice, there's this thing called heterochronic parabiosis. What that means is you surgically connect a young mouse to an old mouse so that they share the same circulatory system, and they live the rest of their life like that. But what you see when you do that is very interesting. The old mouse gets healthier and the young mouse gets sicker. And some people would argue the old mouse gets a little bit younger and the young mouse gets a little bit older. Certainly you can increase lifespan a little bit in the old mouse, and you seem to improve function in multiple tissues and organs. And I think it's been best characterized in the brain and the muscle, but in other tissues and organs as well. So
they're sharing a circulatory system.
Yep.
Okay.
So the interpretation is there are both good things in young blood and bad things in old blood that contribute to functional declines of aging.
I just see ethics going mad here, as in, could you imagine from an ethical point of view, if rich humans got wind of this and they were using poor humans to, it could go anywhere.
Look, I have no doubt that has happened thousands of times already. Oh. Brian Johnson was very public about doing this with his kid, right?
Yeah.
So he took his kid's blood. Now it's, I guess, a little bit better than doing it with prisoners, but yes. First of all, obviously, that is not a pragmatic approach to healthcare, even if it works in humans. Yeah. So that's why a lot of people have been trying to look and what are the factors? What are the factors in young blood that are beneficial? What are the factors in old blood that are detrimental? Then you could go after those factors specifically, and you don't have the ethical problem of collecting blood from teenagers and injecting it into old billionaires, right?
Yeah.
But you can do half of it just by taking the plasma out of older people. So that's the therapeutic plasma exchange. And this is an FDA-approved procedure. It's used in hospitals in some cases where you have high levels of toxins in the blood, for example, that you want to titrate out with therapeutic plasma exchange. But now you can go to quote-unquote longevity clinics, and they'll offer this procedure. And
it's your own plasma that's exchanging. You're not taking anyone else's.
In reality, you're not exchanging plasma. You're taking the plasma out. The exchange is the saline and the albumin that goes back in.
Okay.
Yeah. And then your body will, remake new all of the components of the plasma that you've taken out. So the reason why I did it, the parabiosis data is compelling, but of course that's in mice. We don't know if the same thing's true in people. It makes sense to me that certainly there are going to be inflammatory factors in blood that you dilute out. We know those accumulate with age, and we know they cause a lot of problems with age. So that part made sense to me. And there's a growing body of data. I would say it's not yet conclusive, but a growing body of data for people who have mild cognitive impairment on the road to dementia, that therapeutic plasma exchange can slow that progression. So those three things together, combined with the microplastics and the heavy metals, seem to me like, okay, this actually makes sense. Like there could be some value here. You might get some aging benefits. You're certainly going to get some anti-inflammatory benefits, might get some cognitive functional benefits, and you're definitely going to dilute out microplastics and other toxins that are there. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. And so I did this. It was just over a month ago. I can't say that I felt any different. I did it with
you look great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you should have seen the before picture. I did it with a friend who swears that he feels so much better. He's also, I think, much more susceptible to the placebo effect than I am. So who knows?
Yeah.
I will say both of us slept like a rock. We both came back the next day. We're like, oh my God, I slept so good. So that's the one thing that I can attribute to the TPE. But as part of that, to go back to the microplastics, we did the microplastics test. So we did a test before we started and then immediately after. So they basically took the last amount of blood that came out after the TPE and used that for the microplastics test. And then we just did one last week or the week before, which was our 1 month out. So I just got the results back. As it turns out, I had essentially no microplastics going in. So this test, the numbers range from like 1, like when you get really high, it can be in the hundreds, right? Mine was at 1 going in. So basically undetectable. And it was 5 coming out. Those are probably microplastics from the IV tube. Still very, very low at the population level. But it is true that plastic particles from an IV tube will get into your blood. That's how it works.
But is it not more that we're worried about it, the microplastics actually being in the tissues? So you're taking a blood sample. It's not actually, that's not telling you what's in your tissues.
That's right. You're right. And I'm not going to do a biopsy to find out.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
but I would say, I mean, there's the way microplastics get into your tissues is through your circulatory system.
Okay.
So it's a proxy. So in my case, I had very low. And in talking to the CEO of the company is called Circulate. You know, he told me before I went in, you know, what we have seen is people who have a high microplastics burden will see a somewhere between 50 to 80% drop in their circulating microplastics from the TPE procedure. People who have a low, very low microplastics burden will actually see a slight increase because of the tubing in the IV. That's exactly what I saw. But in people who have high microplastics, the typical course, as I understand it, is, you know, let's say you start at 200, right? 200 particles are measured in your sample. You might come down to 100 after the therapeutic plasma exchange. And then over the next 2 months, it'll come back up. And that might be, I think the most likely explanation is because you're now pulling microplastics that are in your tissue back into circulation. And then you could do TPE again and it goes down and it stays down. So that's the anecdotal. And I just want to caution and say it's anecdotal. We don't have published peer-reviewed studies yet showing this. This is just what's been seen in people who are doing this in longevity clinics. But it also, even though it's anecdotal, it's very plausible. It makes biological sense that that's what's happening. So I'm intrigued with therapeutic plasma exchange as really the only approach that I've heard of that's likely to be able to clear microplastics in people if microplastics turn out to be a really significant health problem, which again, I don't think we know at this point.
You mentioned that it could potentially help with people that are maybe pre-dementia or on the way to, can help. Is that studied at all?
It's being studied now. Yeah, there are a couple of studies going on.
The problem with dementia, though, is generally when someone starts to show signs off, a lot of the plaques in their brain are already there, and it's a very difficult process to stop. Isn't it? You know, what are we saying now? It's a midlife disease that presents in older years. So how can we actually study it properly to say that it could potentially be preventative? Yeah.
So a couple of things to say. I absolutely agree that the further down the path somebody is to dementia, the harder it is to therapeutically treat that disease, either slowing or arresting progression or optimally even reversing it. And the plaques themselves, the degree to which they are actually the problem versus a symptom, I think is still pretty hotly debated. So at a certain level, the plaques become problematic. But initially, I think most people in the field now have gravitated to the idea that they're actually pulling the toxic stuff out into these insoluble aggregates. So it's not really the plaques that are driving the disease. So if you could take care of the soluble toxic proteins, you potentially could arrest the disease at the level that it's at, even after there's been significant plaque formation. And so that's where something like TPE or other therapeutics that are being studied could potentially have a benefit, even in people who already have had some significant progression. And this is speculative. Again, this is my opinion as somebody who I know something about the biology of aging and the biology of dementia. I'm pretty convinced that for many people, if you were to really dial in lifestyle and implement some of these more experimental things like therapeutic plasma exchange, like rapamycin, like some of the supplements that have suggestive benefits, you can at least greatly delay, if not stop, progression of Alzheimer's disease, at least early on. So I think there's reason for hope. There's pretty good evidence. Just lifestyle alone can have a huge impact. So I'm actually pretty optimistic. Of course, people have to lean in and do it. But I think there's actually a really good evidence that people should be hopeful if you catch it early and you take the steps that you need to take.
Okay. And of course, exercise being hugely important for
exercise, people. Nutrition. So I mean, it's clear that in many people, Alzheimer's is either driven by or exacerbated by metabolic dysfunction, right? So nutrition, exercise, sleep. Oh my God, sleep is super important for brain function, right? So all of those things are going to be important.
There's a lot of talk about creatine now, creatine.
So I put that in the same sort of bucket as maybe even a little bit higher than rapamycin and therapeutic plasma exchange. I don't know that creatine is an aging or anti-aging molecule, but first of all, I think we can be very confident that it's safe, or as safe as any molecule ever is going to be, right? Everything has a little bit of risk. And there's lots of evidence, certainly over the last, decades, for body composition in people who are doing resistance training. Is it going to have as big an effect as testosterone? No, nowhere near. So it's small, but significant. And now we're getting hints that it may have benefits in the brain for cognitive function in other parts of the body, seemingly independent of the body composition effects. Those are always a little bit hard to disentangle because, a lot of people don't realize this, but muscle, from a metabolic perspective, plays a huge role in insulin sensitivity. And so this is an interesting class of people who are lean, under-muscled, and have prediabetes or diabetes. Looking at them, you would never guess that person has diabetes. But they do, because they just don't have enough muscle and they can't soak up the glucose.
Is this type 2 diabetes you're talking about?
Yeah, type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's actually an interesting class that we see commonly in the longevity or wellness field. And it's often women who do a lot of cardio. They are extremely lean. They're eating a pretty clean diet, and they're diabetic. And they either don't know they're diabetic or they have no idea why they're diabetic. And it's often because they're under-muscled. So they just don't have that sink for the glucose.
You mentioned rapamycin there.
Mm-hmm.
Can you discuss what that is? So
rapamycin is a drug. It's produced by a bacterium. It was found on Easter Island. That's where it gets its name, Rapa Nui. And it is a molecule that inhibits a protein called mTOR. And mTOR is named after rapamycin. It stands for mechanistic target of rapamycin. So the scientists were not very inventive when they named mTOR. But what it really does, so mTOR you can think of as one of the key gatekeepers of the cell to make a decision: is it a good time to grow and reproduce, or is it a good time to shut down growth and become stress resistant? And that's a fundamental decision every organism that has ever existed throughout evolutionary history has had to make this decision. Sense the environment, decide, should I grow and reproduce or not? Because if you do that at the wrong time, it's a really bad idea from an evolutionarily successful sort of strategy. And if you think about what are the things in the environment that help inform that decision, food is probably the most important. Oxygen and temperature are also going to be important. So when there's not much food around, it's a really bad idea to have babies because you don't have anything to feed them. And mTOR is kind of the decision maker. There are other, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's one of the key decision makers in every, I'm going to use the word eukaryotic, so not bacteria. Every eukaryotic organism on this planet has mTOR, and it makes that decision. And so rapamycin turns down mTOR, and that's the same effect that low food availability has. So in some ways, rapamycin is what people call a caloric restriction mimetic. It mimics at the cellular level the effect of caloric restriction. Okay, so why are we interested in rapamycin in the context of aging? So what we've learned basically over the time period that I've been in the field, starting in around 2003, 2004, there were 4 labs. I was fortunate to be one of them who sort of all stumbled on the observation that when you turn down mTOR, you slow aging. And this has now been seen over the last 20 years in every animal where it's ever been tested, including mice and rats, which are kind of the closest we can get to humans in the laboratory, that when you treat animals with rapamycin, they live, let's just say in mice, because that's where it's been studied the most, up to about 30% longer on average. So you look at the population, average lifespan increases by about 30%. And you slow, as far as we can tell, pretty much every functional decline and disease of aging, and you slow aging at the cellular tissue organ level. And you can start treatment in middle age, which is sort of, at the time, it was thought to be unique. Now we know other things that can do this. So you can start treating a equivalent of a 60-year-old person mouse with rapamycin, and you get pretty much the full benefits. And at least in some tissues and organs, you can actually see functional improvements after declines of aging have already happened. So this is best characterized in mice in the brain, the heart, the immune system, the oral cavity, and the ovaries. So all of those, you take an old mouse, you can measure functional declines, and we can start treatment with rapamycin. And within 6 to 10 weeks, significant improvements in function. In some cases, all the way back to what you would see in a young mouse. So rapamycin doesn't, quote unquote, reverse aging, because it doesn't do that in every tissue, but at least in some places you can improve function. So it's really exciting. And I would say it's really the gold standard in terms of a drug for something that seems to have a positive effect on the biology of aging in laboratory animals.
Okay, but it's in the very early stages at the minute.
Outside of the laboratory. So again, very well established in the laboratory. The question, of course, is, is it going to work in the real world? And so that's something that I set out to start testing about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now. So it was really 2014, I guess, when I really started thinking about what now has become the Dog Aging Project. So Daniel Promislow, who's a colleague and friend of mine, and Kate Creevy, who are the other two directors of the Dog Aging Project and co-founders, had been thinking about this idea of studying aging biology in dogs for a while at that point. And, it's in some ways, it makes perfect sense, right? Everybody's familiar with the idea that 1 human year is about 7 dog years. All that means is dogs age biologically about 7 times faster than people do. And so that makes them very powerful animals in which to study the aging process. And if anybody's ever been to the vet, you look up on the wall and they've got your dog's age in human years. That's what we're talking about. Daniel and Katie had been thinking about, could we create what's called a longitudinal study of aging, just an observational study, get owners to participate, fill out surveys, send us their veterinary records, send us biological samples, and we could study the whole life course of most dogs in 12 years. Depends a little bit on body size, but most dogs will go from being puppies to elderly, or for large dogs, they'll have passed their life expectancy in that sort of a time frame, 12 years. To do the same study in people would take you, 70 years. And dogs, of course, share our environment in a way that mice in the laboratory don't. So it captures both the aging process and the environmental piece that we don't study in the laboratory in a time frame that's amenable to scientific discovery. And as we've already sort of discussed, for many people, our dogs are part of our family. So it's a very socially relevant animal in which to study the aging process. So Daniel and Katie have been thinking about this, and Daniel and I were co-directors of a summer course at Woods Hole on the biology of aging, and we were talking a lot about this. And I had this light bulb moment, which in hindsight is completely obvious, but I obviously understood why studying aging in dogs would be great. I'm a dog person. I love the idea. And then I thought, we know all these things in mice that slow aging, rapamycin, caloric restriction. Some of these things are going to work in dogs. The biology of aging is just so conserved. There's no question in my mind. There wasn't then, there isn't now. But some of these things are going to work in dogs. And there's like, oh my God, we could slow aging in dogs. I'm like, oh my God, I want my dog to live 20% longer. And I want your dog, and I want everybody's. And so I had that intuitive leap. And then I was like, I have to do this. There was just no question. Ethically, morally, I have to do this. So I set out from that day trying to raise money to do a clinical trial in dogs. And in thinking about what to test, rapamycin came right to the top, because at the time it was the gold standard, and it still is. Caloric restriction would be the other thing you would think about, but it immediately became clear to me that getting owners to calorically restrict their dogs by 40% or whatever would probably not, that clinical trial would probably fail. Are
you suggesting that if we calorie restricted dogs, that it would increase their lifespan? And
there's a little bit of data to support that. And I think there were Labradors in the lab. So dogs in a laboratory setting put on caloric restriction. I think it was Purina that did that study 20, 30 years ago. It was a 20%, I think, caloric restriction, and it was a smallish effect on lifespan. But yeah, in mice, you can get up to 50, 60% increase in lifespan with caloric restriction. Now, you have to be careful. Obviously, it has to be done right. It can't be malnutrition. And I want to give this caveat clearly. I believe, and the data seem to support, early data, that caloric restriction in humans does slow biological aging. And I believe most humans practicing caloric restriction will not live longer, because mice in the laboratory do not typically suffer from, or certainly not die from, frailty, falls, fractures, sarcopenia. People on caloric restriction will very likely get those things, and it will be a significant cause of mortality.
Because the caloric restriction affects muscles, bones, etc., which leads to the immobility, frailty, falls, etc. Okay.
Even if you take care of all the micronutrients, you're still going to have low bone density. You're still going to have low muscle mass. And then there's the whole social, psychological component. So there are probably a small fraction of people who can really do chronic, we're talking decades long, 30, 40% caloric restriction. In our world that we live in now, I think for most people, that would be, if you could do it, you would be miserable. So from a quality of life perspective, I don't think it's something that most people would want to do. It's my belief that it probably wouldn't have a significant lifespan benefit because of the negative side effects that mice in the laboratory don't die from.
Okay.
So I just want to be clear that
it was on the tip of my tongue to ask you anyway. So you've just answered the question.
It's the best studied intervention for slowing aging in laboratory animals, and we've learned a lot from caloric restriction. I just don't think it's something we're going to be able to take out of the laboratory. Having said that, caloric restriction and overnutrition is a gradient, and so where you fall on that, I think certainly does affect your rate of aging, and so optimally, probably for most people, being towards the low to mid end of normal body weight. And again, I know that's a huge generalization. Body composition plays a huge role there, but just at the population level, being towards the low to middle range of normal body weight is probably the best for mortality for most people and quality of life. And we haven't talked about the GLP-1 drugs. Those may be a way for more people to get there. We can come back to the GLPs if you want to. So I think that's an interesting thing from the perspective of longevity as well. Okay, so rapamycin, I set out to try to create a clinical trial of rapamycin in dogs. It took a long time. We finally got the first grant to create the dog aging project towards the end of 2018. And now we have 50,000 plus dog longitudinal study of aging and a clinical trial of rapamycin that's about half done. So that clinical trial was just refunded. So it will get done in the next funding cycle. The pandemic slowed us down a little bit, and then I think we can know the answer. Does rapamycin slow aging in dogs?
How do they take it? Is it orally?
Yeah, it's a pill. And so I didn't talk about this. Rapamycin is FDA approved. It's called sirolimus in the clinical world. And this is, from a reputation perspective, it's a bad thing for rapamycin. It was actually first clinically approved as an organ transplant drug. So it is typically referred to as an immunosuppressant. And at high doses, it absolutely does modestly to partially suppress the immune system. It's not a very good immunosuppressant just by itself, but in organ transplant patients, it's always given with a cocktail of drugs. And it helps prevent your body from rejecting the transplanted organ. Those are at high doses, and they're people typically taking rapamycin daily. What we have come to believe, and there's good data to support this, is in humans, you can back off on the doses. You take it once weekly is now what most have gravitated to. This is done off-label, meaning it can be prescribed by a doctor, but it's not for the FDA-approved label indication, which would be organ transplant rejection. So there are now probably, I don't know, I really don't know the number. I'm guessing tens of thousands of people taking rapamycin off-label with the hope that it will improve their health span or potentially lifespan. And they're usually doing around 6 milligrams once a week.
And is this a clinical trial that's going on, or is it just the doctors are doing this because the people want it to happen?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. I wish there were clinical trials happening. I've been advocating for clinical trials. The thing is, when you think about a drug that slows aging, you have got your choice of endpoints you could do for a clinical trial because there are so many diseases and conditions that are age associated. So there are some small clinical trials of rapamycin happening now. So one is for periodontal disease. That's being done by Jonathan Ahn, who's at the University of Washington. That's actually based on work we did in my lab when John was a graduate student with me, where we showed in mice you could reverse periodontal disease in aged mice with rapamycin.
That's the thing with giving a drug to someone to reduce aging, that isn't precise enough. It has to, I suppose, impact on a disease, or...
It doesn't have to impact on a disease. It's a good question because there's a lot of confusion even among people in the clinical longevity community who don't really understand how FDA works.
Yeah.
It helps if it's a disease, but it's still, even if it's a disease, you need a quantitative thing that you can measure that is an indication of that disease that the FDA has agreed in advance is predictive of quality or quantity of life for a certain population of people. So it can be something like immune function. So there was a company called Restore Bio that actually got fairly far down the path with a derivative of rapamycin, showing that in healthy older people, you could give them this derivative for 6 weeks. It's called everolimus. And compared to placebo, you got a better flu vaccine response. And those people went on and had fewer upper respiratory tract infections over the next 6 to 12 months. And that is based on mouse work. So you may recall I mentioned earlier that rapamycin can reverse functional declines in the immune system, the oral cavity, I mentioned periodontal disease, ovaries, a couple other places. So that human study from Restore Bio was based on the mouse work where they showed that 6 weeks of rapamycin treatment could boost influenza vaccine response. And so then there's another clinical trial at Columbia for premature ovarian failure, because in mice, rapamycin has been shown to reverse ovarian decline. So there are some small trials happening. The problem...
So could that help with menopause then, and help with...
It could. I mean, again, it depends on what you mean by help. It certainly could impact menopause. It could potentially delay menopause. There are anecdotal reports, and I'm just going to say these are N of 1. They're self-reports of women who are perimenopausal going on rapamycin, and they sometimes have what they report as pretty profound reversion of symptoms. So that's why we need the clinical trial, because these anecdotal reports are very intriguing, and placebo effect is real, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting.
So it'd be interesting to see if you took a perimenopausal woman that obviously had those hormonal fluctuations and you measured those hormones when she's on the rapamycin, whether or not her estrogen levels just stabilized. And then I suppose what would be really interesting is, feel like bringing your ovaries back from the death post-menopausal woman, if we could, but this is why with premature ovarian insufficiency, if it's pointing towards helping with that, why couldn't it help older women?
In the mouse studies, it was in the context of normal aging. Now, mice don't go through a true menopause. They go exactly the way humans do, but they definitely see this decline in ovarian function with age. That's the context for the mouse experiments. The reason why the people doing the ovarian study, Yushin Su is a good friend of mine at Columbia, and Zeb Williams, also at Columbia. The reason why they picked premature ovarian failure as opposed to a menopause trial is primarily because the progression to the endpoint is much more defined and consistent than in a natural population of women going through menopause. So for a clinical trial perspective, it's just logistically much easier to get a statistically meaningful result in that population as opposed to menopause. But yes, in principle, it should have the same effect if it's going to have that effect in humans. And I mean, we talked about dementia. There is just, there's got to be dozens of papers on different animal models of both cognitive decline during normal aging and various dementias, including Alzheimer's disease. And I know nobody likes the mouse models of Alzheimer's disease with good reason, but the rapamycin effects extend way beyond just those models to cognitive function during normal aging, Parkinson's disease. Veronica Galvin and I tried to argue hard for an Alzheimer's disease clinical trial for rapamycin more than a decade ago. Just never happened. Very frustrating, but it has promise there. There were actually 2 studies that came out this year, very small, showing that in people who have one copy of a gene called ApoE. So ApoE4, it's the strongest genetic variant for Alzheimer's disease that's out there, also for cardiovascular disease. So if you have one copy, you're at, I think it's about a 5-fold increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. If you have 2 copies of ApoE4, you're at about a 20-fold increased risk. So what these studies showed was that in people who are carriers of ApoE4, who are mildly symptomatic in terms of cognitive decline, by MRI, you can within 6 weeks, maybe it was 12 weeks of rapamycin treatment, you can actually see improvements in brain volume in the hippocampus and the caudate nucleus, 2 regions that are affected by Alzheimer's disease with rapamycin treatment, and more cerebral blood flow. So that parallels exactly what's been seen in the animal models. I talked earlier about if we did everything, if we threw everything we had at the wall for people who are on the path to Alzheimer's disease, I think there's a pretty good chance we could halt progression. I'd put rapamycin in that bucket. I think it's intriguing and exciting and frustrating that we don't have the definitive clinical trials yet. It's a failure of the scientific process, in my view.
And what are the dogs that are on the aging project and the humans that have been trialing it in their small numbers and the mice, what are the side effect profiles that we're seeing?
So in mice, first of all, it's hard to define side effects. So the two things people will point to in the mice that seem real, one is, and this is seen in organ transplant patients as well, is basically a dramatic decline in spermatogenesis. So you basically stop sperm production. Remember how I started this was this fundamental decision, have babies or don't have babies, right? That's really what's happening there. So you're shutting down primary processes involved in sperm production.
But it doesn't affect egg health?
I don't know how you would measure egg health. So
the only way you measure it is actually take them out of the ovaries.
Yeah. So in mice, I don't believe that's been done.
Okay.
So here's the thing. It's also a dose effect. If you push the rapamycin dose high enough, and this is where a lot of people who are concerned about rapamycin will point to all sorts of things that rapamycin does at a really, really high dose. If you push the dose high enough, you basically shut down all cell division. And so what you see there is you will see a decline in the ability to make new muscle. You will see a decline in the ability to make new memories. But the doses we're talking about are way, way below that. So in mice, the only other side effect that people will typically point to is decrease in insulin sensitivity. The problem is, and that seems bad, right? That would be consistent with going down the path to diabetes. The problem is the way those experiments are done is you take an old mouse that's been on rapamycin, you compare it to a mouse that's never seen rapamycin, and you give it the mouse equivalent of an oral glucose tolerance test. So if you've ever gone to your doctor and they make you drink this sugar drink and then they measure your glucose and your insulin. So you inject them with a bunch of sugar and then you measure glucose and insulin, and that's a proxy for how effective their body is at secreting insulin and clearing the glucose. Problem is, the mice that have been on rapamycin are in a fundamentally different metabolic state. And so they are not used to this is my interpretation. They're not used to metabolizing glucose. And so when you give them a non-physiological amount of glucose all at once, they're just not adapted to clear it as rapidly. They do not show any signs of increased HbA1c, which is a measure of prediabetes, or fasting glucose. So I don't think that's a real thing. I think it's an artifact of the way that oral glucose tolerance test, or the mouse version of that, works. Okay, so that's in mice. In dogs, we've really seen nothing, certainly no adverse events. I have to be clear, the big clinical trial is still blinded. So we don't know which dogs are in which group, placebo versus rapamycin, so I can't tell you there. But
the study's for 10 years, is it?
No, it's a 1-year treatment, 2-year follow-up, but we have to get all the dogs enrolled before.
Okay.
We could talk about that too. The reason why it's a 3-year observation period is in the dogs that we're recruiting, they have to be larger dogs, so they're aging faster, and they have to be over 7 years old, so they're already middle-aged. In that population, there will be enough mortality. This is sad to think about, but the only way you can see an increase in lifespan is if a significant fraction of the dogs die over the observation period.
Okay.
So that's the rationale for that. So we've done 2 safety studies before we started the big study. Again, dogs are like people's children. You absolutely want to make sure anything you do is not going to harm the dog. So we did these 2 safety studies. One was 10 weeks, one was 6 months. In those, we saw no significant side effects. One dog developed high triglycerides, and it went away when the dog came off rapamycin, probably due to rapamycin. But dogs don't really get vascular disease, so high triglycerides in dogs aren't as concerning as they might be in people. Interestingly, in the first study, we saw evidence for improvements in heart function, matching exactly the same parameters that were measured in mice. That was done by echocardiography, which is an ultrasound of the heart. And owners self-reported that their dogs, and they didn't know, the owners were blinded, that self-reported that their dogs were more active, consistent with the idea that rapamycin was having a positive effect on quality of life. That was true in both studies. So I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about at least significant side effects in dogs over the length of the treatment period that we're using, which is a year. And we certainly haven't seen any, even though I can't tell you which dogs are in which group at this point. And then in people, again, I mentioned there are probably tens of thousands of people using rapamycin off-label. We did a study that we published a couple of years ago now, where we collected survey data from 333 people who had used rapamycin off-label, and we compared it was about 150 people who'd never used rapamycin. And one of the things we did was we asked, in the last 3 months, have you experienced, and then we had a list of like 40 potential side effects. Only one thing was significantly higher in the rapamycin users, and that was canker sores. So about 10 to 15% of people using rapamycin off-label will get canker sores in their mouth.
So that's like ulcers in your mouth.
Yeah, and that is a common side effect in organ transplant patients. Now, in the organ transplant patients taking higher doses, there are pretty significant ulcers. In the people using off-label, it seems like it's a typical canker sore that you might get even if you weren't taking rapamycin.
You would think that would be to do with immunosuppression, is that right?
Unclear. I don't think people really know what's causing the canker sores. It probably has to do with the rate of cell division of the cells along the inner lining of the mouth, but I don't think we really know at this point. And we don't know why some people get them. Some people will start taking rapamycin, get a canker sore, stop taking it, it'll go away, start again, and they don't get it. So I just don't think we understand. It's real though. Definitely that's a real thing that, again, 10 to 15% of people will get. Outside of that, there were, I think, 5 or 6 other things that were statistically different between the two groups, but they were all better in the rapamycin users. So may or may not be anything real. The other thing that was interesting from that study was that this was 2022 to 2023 that we were collecting the data. So pretty close to the pandemic. A lot of the people have been using rapamycin through the pandemic. So we thought we might as well ask, is there any effect on COVID infection or outcome? So no difference in rates of infection. They were right on top of each other. So using rapamycin did not increase or decrease the likelihood of getting COVID-19 infection. But among the people who used rapamycin through the period of their infection, and this is where it's interesting, because some people got COVID and they thought, oh, I better stop taking the rapamycin. Some people got COVID and they kept taking it, right? Of the people who stopped taking it, their risk of moderate or severe defined as needing to go to the hospital infection, was the same as the non-users. Among the people who took it through the whole period of COVID infection, it was lower. And their likelihood of having persistent symptoms consistent with long COVID, we couldn't diagnose that because this was survey-based, was also lower in the people who used rapamycin throughout. There is now a growing body of literature that in virus-induced chronic inflammatory conditions, rapamycin could be beneficial. In fact, there was a paper that just came out on chronic fatigue syndrome. Super interesting. I didn't know a lot about chronic fatigue syndrome before this paper came out. So it's my understanding from reading this paper that there are at least 2 categories of chronic fatigue syndrome. One that is not clearly linked to a significant viral infection, and the other that is clearly post-significant viral infection. And the hypothesis has been it's a chronic inflammatory state after this viral infection that's driving the fatigue symptoms. In this study, I think it was like 60-ish people. These are all people who were prescribed rapamycin off-label. So they were symptomatic coming in, not placebo-controlled. In that study, I think it was 75% of the people responded to rapamycin. In response, meaning that they self-reported significant improvements in their symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome. And that was almost all, if not exclusively, in the people who had post-viral chronic fatigue syndrome. So one hypothesis is the post-viral inflammation was driving chronic fatigue syndrome, and those people predominantly responded very well to rapamycin, which makes perfect sense because rapamycin is really good at knocking down chronic sterile inflammation.
And is rapamycin, is it patented or is it?
It's off patent. Yeah, it's a generic. Yeah.
It's a generic. So
yeah. That's
technically, if we found that this was great for all the things that you would hope that it would be, it could be rolled out quickly and not very expensively.
Yeah, I mean, it's not super expensive now, but it's not dirt cheap like metformin or something like that. But it's not super expensive. I think, with discounts, you can usually get it for like $1 or $2 a milligram, and people take 6 milligrams a week. So it's not really expensive. But also there's an economy of scale. Like there is not a mass market for rapamycin. So I have to believe the cost would come down if that ever were to happen.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting drug. But the being off-label, off patent is also probably why we haven't seen the clinical trials to answer the darn questions.
Because it's not going to make loads of money for whomever owns the patent of it. So that's why I asked that question.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, you can understand why pharmaceutical companies aren't going to invest in those clinical trials. Where I think the ball has been dropped is we have organizations like the National Institutes of Health in the United States that could very well fund these kinds of clinical trials, and they haven't. So it's too bad.
So apart from all of the things that you have suggested will help with longevity and health span, is there anything that you haven't mentioned in your little satchel of information?
I mean, I'm intrigued. I haven't yet tried, and again, I'm not recommending people try this, but I'm intrigued by the data, this protocol called TRIM, which is for thymic rejuvenation. So this is something that a scientist named Greg Fahey pioneered. So early on in life, our thymus involutes, and so we have a pretty dramatic decline in immune cell production. And that happens like in the late teenage years in most people. And so when that happens, what you have is a shrinkage of the thymus and then an involution of fat into the thymus, and then this corresponding decline in new T cell production, immune cell production. And Greg has shown that, at least in a subset of people, a combination of growth hormone, DHEA, and he uses metformin, and we could talk about why all of those are there. I personally don't think the metformin's important or even necessarily the best thing to use. The reason why he put metformin in there is because growth hormone can have negative impacts on insulin sensitivity, and he thought you should just have something in there to blunt those effects. Anyways, in a subset of people, he can show at least a reversal at the morphological level, so by MRI, of the thymus. What I think is still lacking is understanding of how effective that is at boosting immune function, but it's intriguing. And so I'm interested in following that and seeing where that goes. I'm actually interested in trying it myself. I sort of, as you might be able to tell, I sort of like to try things myself when it makes sense. I don't try everything.
Are you on rapamycin?
I have been on rapamycin multiple times. I tend to cycle it. Yeah.
Okay. Why cycle? Why not just take it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I can tell you the reason why the first time I did it. So we talked about my progression to testosterone. If you had asked me 10 years ago, should people be taking rapamycin off label? I would have been like, no way. 5 years ago, I was starting to think about it. It was about 5 years ago. It was 6 years ago now. I started having really, really bad pain in my right shoulder, and it got progressively worse, and I wasn't really able to sleep. But I was also a pretty stereotypical, I was late 40s at that point guy, not going to the doctor very often. I'm like, oh, it'll get better. I'm just going to keep lifting weights and, it'll be fine. And then it got to the point where we have a park across the street from our house, and I went out to throw a ball with my youngest son, and I couldn't do that motion. And I had to be like, oh man, I'm sorry, Jace. I can't do it. And that, like, emotionally was really tough. That was the first real age-related, condition that I was like, oh my God, I'm getting old. So anyways,
I've had a few of those moments.
It's like, you can't, probably younger people listening to this can't appreciate what that's like, but
it's fucking awful. That's what it is. I'll tell you that now. It's like your mortality's staring you in the face, isn't it?
Yeah, I wasn't really worried about dying, but the fact that I couldn't throw a football with my son was very emotionally challenging. So anyways, that's what kind of got me to the point where I was like, okay, I have to go get this fixed. And I had convinced myself I had a torn rotator cuff. Like, no data. I was just convinced. So I went to my primary care doc, the same guy, and I was like, Doc, I've got a torn rotator cuff. I can't go like this. I can't sleep. I need a referral to a specialist so I can get surgery. He's like, no, I want you to go to physical therapy first. And so I had to do that. That made it worse. I went back and I was really aggressive. And I'm like, give me the referral to the specialist. And so he did. And within 15 minutes, the orthopedic specialist, he's like, moving my arm different ways. And where does it hurt? It's like, you don't have a torn rotator cuff. You have adhesive capsulitis. And I was like, what is that? It's like, it's called frozen shoulder. It's very common. It's more common in women than men, but it also happens in men about your age. And he's like, I can give you a shot into the joint of steroids. I don't like to do that because it sometimes causes long-term degradation of the cartilage. So I want you to go back to physical therapy, and it might go away in a year. That's what he said to me. It's like, it might go away in a year. I was like, and I vividly remember going out to my car, and I was pissed off. And I'm like, I cannot do this for a year. And so he described to me, it's a chronic inflammation of the shoulder capsule.
Oh, you're like, what do I know?
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Inflammation.
That's right.
Okay.
I'm studying this drug. At that point, we had done a series of experiments in mice showing we could give it for 12 weeks and increase lifespan by like 20%. And we could reverse periodontal disease. So we were actually just finishing those periodontal disease studies. And as part of those studies, we measured a bunch of inflammatory markers, both in circulation and in the gingival tissue, the gums. So I knew it blunted all of these inflammatory markers that go along with aging. And I'm like, okay, this is an age-related inflammatory condition. Studying this drug, I'm giving it to dogs. I know it's safe. I should just try it. And so again, I'm lucky in the sense that I have access to physicians who will do these kinds of experiments with me. So I was able to get a prescription for rapamycin. I went in.
You didn't even need a prescription. You could just walk into the lab. Stop lying.
You just taking the dogs. No, you can't actually. There are reasons why you wouldn't want to take the stuff that we give the mice.
Okay,
It has to do with the acidity of the stomach and bioavailability. But I could have taken the dog medication. That's true. So I went in, with the idea that I was going to do 6 milligrams once a week for 10 weeks and then evaluate. And within a couple of weeks, I had the perception that the pain was going down. And by the end of the 10 weeks, it was 95% gone. Like I had 95% range of motion back and it wasn't painful anymore. And so could it have been placebo effect? Sure, it could have been, but it was pretty severe. And I mean, anybody who's had frozen shoulder, I think will attest that it's pretty bad. And it's just very biologically plausible that it was the rapamycin that did that. So that's where I kind of got the idea of doing a 10 to 12 week course, knock down the inflammation, and then hypothetically, it's going to take a while for that age-related inflammation to come back up. And then I'll do another course. Could I take it continuously? Yeah. Might it be better from a longevity perspective? Who knows, right? So that's just sort of the way I've done it. And to be honest, given how scientific I am in other areas of my life, I am not very scientific about the way I do rapamycin. I've tried 6 milligrams, 8 milligrams, 10 milligrams. Sometimes I take 3 months off. Sometimes I take 9 months off.
Okay.
Just kind of take it whenever.
You're like, I'm just going to go with the flow here.
That's me. So I've done probably, 5 or 6 cycles of rapamycin. Nothing as profound as the frozen shoulder. But fortunately, I haven't had any conditions like that. I've done blood work. I know how fast I metabolize it. I would say the one thing I typically feel is every time I take rapamycin, after having been off it for, 3 to 6 months, I've got just a little bit of pain in my wrists and elbows when I lift weights. That seems to go away when I take rapamycin. Again, it could be placebo effect. It's pretty mild, but it could also be chronic inflammation buildup that is knocked down by rapamycin. So
you've mentioned chronic inflammation a few times. Inflammation is a big topic these days.
Yeah.
How can people reduce the amount of inflammation in their body?
Yeah. So inflammation is absolutely one of the hallmarks of aging. I think it is, if you had to pick one, it is the hallmark of biological aging that drives a lot of symptoms we experience with age. I don't know how much it's really accelerating aging or causing age-related disease. Some certainly, but a lot of the symptoms we experience. So how do you bring down inflammation? I mean, we talked about rapamycin, but really the go-to is fasting or cutting calories. Now, we talked about caloric restriction and why that might not be a good idea over the long term for people. Eating a clean diet is
what
also
does clean
just
mean?
as good. Yeah. So cutting out highly processed foods, cutting out foods that are high in simple sugars, right? Those are going to be inflammatory foods. There's some data to support this, and it's just a very logical presumption that one of the things in our diets that drives inflammation is when we eat foods that our bodies are not evolved to experience. What is an immune response? It's a response to a foreign object in your body. If we eat foods that are industrial, that have a lot of things in them that we as animals have not evolved to experience, that's going to potentially be something our body recognizes as foreign and drives an inflammatory response. That's why I say cutting back, it's almost impossible to completely avoid processed foods. Cutting back on highly processed foods is probably a good idea from the perspective of chronic inflammation and a lot of the gut issues that go along with that. So I think diet is probably the biggest lever that people can pull.
And when you said fasting,
inflammation. Yeah.
What's that look like? 16 hours off, 8 hours on?
No. So this is where there's a little bit of sloppy terminology, I'll just say. So I call what you just referred to, the 8-16 or 12-12, as time-restricted eating. Whereas fasting, I think of as at least a 24-hour period without food. Now, 24 hours is arbitrary.
That's hardcore.
I don't do it.
Okay.
I'm just saying, if you want to do something that's going to be anti-inflammatory, I'm actually not a big believer in fasting or time-restricted eating from a slowing aging perspective. I think both of those can be very powerful ways for people to avoid overeating. Particularly time-restricted eating, I think for some people is a useful strategy to avoid overeating. I don't think it's a particularly beneficial from is it going to slow my aging perspective. The data in mice are pretty clear. If you're eating the same amount, you're just eating it at a smaller window, there's not much benefit that accrues to that. So I think it's more about how much you eat. And then, I mean, you can kind of think of it this way, right? There's how much you eat, what you eat, and when you eat. And I would sort of rank them in that order. I think how much you eat and what you eat are really, really important. When you eat, important, but not, it's not going to be the driving factor. I don't think you're going to get where you want to get to just by time-restricted eating.
Do you think that the time-restricted eating trend that's going on now at the minute, and they say that when you time restrict or you intermittent fast, you're giving your body a break from trying to digest food, you're allowing it to rest, therefore that's the real benefit of it?
It's a nice thing to say that seems intuitive. I don't think there's much data to support that, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, again, I've been a biologist long enough that I've had lots of ideas that seemed really great and made a lot of sense. And then we did the experiment and they were completely wrong. So I don't really put a lot of faith in that. And part of the reason is, and I could be completely wrong. That's the other thing I have to admit, right? We might find out 20 years from now, time-restricted eating has all these benefits. What I can say is the studies that have been done well, and there aren't a lot of them in both mice and humans, when you control for caloric consumption, the benefits pretty much completely go away. And the human studies that have reported benefits from time-restricted eating, there are roughly the same number that did not see any benefits. So if there is an effect, it's pretty small. That's why I say if time-restricted eating helps you maintain a healthy body weight because it's a rule you can follow that makes it easier for you, great, do it. Just don't expect it to be the game changer, and don't. What I would say is the mistake is to do time-restricted eating and think you can eat whatever you want and you can eat as much as you want, because that's not the case.
Okay. And then what do you eat then?
Well, when I travel, it's not as good as it is when I'm at home. So let's just stick with what I typically eat at home.
Okay.
So
I won't tell everyone about the stove with jam the earlier.
No, it's actually kind of funny because, well, this is a little bit of a tangent. You can decide if you want to leave this in or not. But it's actually kind of funny because some people in the sort of longevity bubble go, in my view, way over the top in trying to be perfect in everything, or at least present themselves as perfect in everything to their followers, right? And so there was this, what I at least thought was very humorous Twitter exchange between David Sinclair, who's a scientist in this space. I'll put air quotes around that, scientist, who posted something on Twitter about how he ate, I don't know, some protein bar, some sort of snack bar, and it caused his glucose to go crazy because he was wearing a continuous glucose monitor, which, by the way, I am too, nothing against CGMs, and he didn't sleep well, and he's never going to eat a snack bar again. And then Brian Johnson, who's a character who I have complex thoughts about, reposted his tweet. And I can't remember the exact words, but it was something like, that MFer Sinclair is such a snowflake, which I thought was hilarious coming from Brian Johnson.
Yeah.
And then he said, oh, I'm just joking. Obviously, I'm poking fun at myself. And as it turns out, I had just seen this after. So my wife and I were in Tennessee for an event, and we had a great dinner. We never eat dessert, but they had a chocolate peanut butter pie. And I was like, ooh, that sounds good. And she was like, we got to get that. So we got that. We split it. She filmed me because she thought it would be funny seeing me eat that, because I would never eat that. And then I saw this exchange. And so then I put my own tweet. I retweeted Brian's. And basically it was, you guys got to relax. Like, seriously, eating healthy is important, but live a little bit. Have fun once in a while. And so I do think that is a lesson. Like, trying to be so rigid that you have anxiety about your lifestyle is probably not healthy. And I think having fun with people and have a drink, have a dessert. I'm grateful that I got to have that dinner with my wife and have that awesome dessert, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's an important part of it too. So that was a tangent. I don't eat peanut butter chocolate pie very often, but when I do, I enjoy it and I'm not going to feel guilty about it. Okay. So what is my typical diet? It's gotten a lot better. And I would say it's still evolving. Like, I think the other thing is, even the so-called experts, we're still learning. So I try to avoid highly processed foods as much as possible. I will say protein bars are still a little bit my weakness because they're just so easy to get high quality protein and a pretty good amount of fiber and I don't have to put in any work. Is that great? I don't know. But I also think I'm eating protein bars that are pretty good in terms of composition. Outside of that, I don't eat a lot of highly processed food. So I have a lot of salads. I've actually grown to enjoy keto bread. I'm just hoping we don't find out 5 years from now that it causes some horrible cancer. But these keto breads, actually, they're a little bit of an acquired taste. And I didn't eat much bread until I found the keto bread. I don't know if you have them in Ireland. They're all over the place in the United States now. Yeah, some of them are really good when you look at the macros. So, you might have 35 calories in a slice of bread, 10 grams of fiber, and a bunch of protein. Like,
what are they making it out of? That sounds highly processed.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, that's what my wife said. And there's a bakery in New York that they say they bake it fresh and they'll ship it to you, called Royo, which I just found. They've got bagels that have like 30 grams of fiber. So that's what I mean. Maybe it is highly processed. I don't know. Anyways, if I'm going to have bread, I'm going to have keto bread. I don't eat a lot of it, but it's nice because I wasn't eating bread hardly at all. A lot of vegetables, yogurt, I really like. And then I eat meat. I don't eat a ton of red meat. I've cut way back, but I still will have red meat once or twice a week. A lot of salmon and fish. I do measure my mercury. My mercury's fine. So, yeah. So
chicken and
chicken. We have chicken.
It sounds like
turkey. If we can get it.
I honestly thought you were going to say I intermittent fast. I only eat carnivore, or I thought you were going to say all this wild stuff. So actually, it's actually really refreshing, and I think that you've probably eased some people's anxieties too, because I think there's a lot of anxiety out there about what people should be eating, the amount of time that they should spend a day eating, and the whole intermittent fasting thing can really be. It can actually be difficult to live your life around intermittent fasting too, but depending on what stage you
have to figure out what works for you. Diet too, right? Like again, I think my diet works really well for me, in part because I'm not super picky, and in part because my wife is very health conscious. And so she's helped me a lot because she's actually taught me a lot about
I think I need to get your wife on the podcast.
Maybe so.
For a living?
She's an author.
Okay.
Yeah. So she's great. And she makes, healthy dinners, because if it was me, I would probably just get a bagged salad from the grocery store and, eat that. So we have some diversity that way as well.
Okay.
And then the other thing I put under the diet is we've cut way back on the amount of alcohol we consume, which I mentioned earlier. Yeah. And so now the nice thing is, like, my tastes have completely shifted. Like, I am not tempted at all. Well, aside from the peanut butter and chocolate pie, but even that's pretty rare. Like, we go out to dinner, I'm not tempted by dessert. I would much rather actually get a salad usually than anything else on the menu. I'm not tempted by pastas. So I've come to enjoy eating.
I don't know. I don't think a lot of people could actually relate to that now, not being tempted to pass.
No, I don't think you're right. I don't think they can. And I don't think I could have 10 years ago. And I don't know, again, I can only talk about my own experience, but I do believe that many people, once you get disconnected from those kinds of foods, you can acquire a taste for a healthy diet. I think you can acquire habits around lifestyle if you aren't trying to be perfect, right, that you actually enjoy. And that's part of it. Like, if you're going to be successful at this, it's got to be something you can stick with for the long run, right? So I think there's also a psychological shift. Again, we haven't really talked about psychological component or mental health component, which is hugely important and largely ignored. I think there is a psychological part here about kind of reframing it. I think too often people don't want to eat a healthy diet because I won't get to eat the stuff that I like, and I have to eat the stuff that I don't like, right? So when you frame it that way, it seems like it's a terrible thing. Instead of, I get to eat these whole foods and I feel better after doing it. And sure, it takes a little while to get into that habit, but once you do, you can recognize you're actually in a better place. Same thing with exercise. So I think, we sometimes talk ourselves out of becoming healthy. And sometimes you have to actually put some effort into changing that psychology.
You mentioned you have a continuous glucose monitor on you. So I'm interested in that because there's a lot of talk about people that don't have diabetes or are not pre-diabetic using them. I think the cynic in me would see it as a marketing tool and a way for companies to make money, suggesting that normal, healthy people need to check their glucose levels on a regular basis. So why do you do it?
Well, first I'll say the cynic in you is right. There are companies that do that, just like there are companies that market blood tests, right? It can be viewed through two lenses depending on how it's used. I think, and we use continuous glucose monitoring in our clinical programs at Optisan because it is if not the most powerful, one of the most powerful educational tools around lifestyle. Because when used in combination with an educational protocol, people can actually learn how what they're eating impacts their physiology. And I think part of the reason why continuous glucose monitors have gotten a little bit of a bad name among certain circles is, one, they have been marketed by companies without any medical care. And two, there's been some misinformation out there, like all spikes are bad and you should be scared if your glucose ever spikes. And so consumers are getting bad information and are having some suboptimal outcomes because of that bad information. But if you can explain to people what's happening and you can explain to people what the shape of the spike means and that, oh yeah, that is an indication that you are on the path to prediabetes potentially, and there are things we can do about it. Or, oh yeah, that's what that bagel does to you. I mean, again, I talked about the keto bagels, right? I used to eat bagels all the time. I loved bagels. And first time I ever wore a CGM, this is several years ago now, my wife and I were in New York, and she was like, oh, there's this bakery that I've always wanted to go to, this bagel shop I've always wanted to go to. We got to go there. And so we went and got bagel with cream cheese and probably had salmon on it or whatever. And I just started wearing the glucose monitor, and I didn't have the education that I should have had going in. And we go back to the hotel room, and it's like an hour later, and the alarm starts going off, or 2 hours later, or whatever, on my CGM. The alarm starts going off. It's the first time that happened to me. And I'm looking at my phone, and there's this giant spike from the bagel. And the alarm, of course, is because what happens is you go up, and then you secrete all this insulin, and the glucose goes down, and then you undershoot, and you go low. That's what the alarm goes off. Because if you're diabetic and using it, and your blood glucose gets too low because you've injected too much insulin, that can be really bad. So the alarm starts going off, and it scared the crap out of me. I was like, for a second, I was like, oh my God, I'm dying. And I'm like, no, I'm not dying. But having said that, I could not unlearn what I learned about what a bagel does to my blood glucose. And I think that's the message. When that's done in the right way, people get a lot of information. And it is one of the stickiest behavior modifying tools that I've seen in terms of diet. People remember, and the next time they're tempted to have that, whatever it is for you that causes your blood glucose to spike like that, you'll at least think twice. And so again, there's a lot of human psychology involved here. And it's been my perception that many people, that'll last for about 3 months or 6 months. And then they kind of will, if they aren't continuing in a program dedicated to improving their health, they'll kind of drift back towards their old eating habits. But if you do a CGM every 6 months, sometimes for people, you learn something new every time too. So I would just say it's a useful tool in a couple of ways. One, definitely will identify people who are pre-diabetic or diabetic and don't know it. As long as you know how to interpret the CGM, it's pretty unambiguous if you are diabetic or pre-diabetic. And we see a lot of that in our clinical programs. And two, it's behavior modifying if done right, in a good way, generally. So the reason why I'm wearing one now, I very rarely wear a CGM anymore, but so we never got through the whole list of things that I'm interested in. Another thing I'm interested in is something called SGLT2 inhibitors. So these are drugs that have been shown to increase lifespan in mice. There's this really, let me just take a tangent here. This is really interesting. There was this really interesting study that was done where they looked at data from the UK Biobank, right? So this data set has, I don't remember how many people, but 100,000 plus people. And it has, in addition to a lot of other data, prescription medications. So what they asked was a very simple question. Look across the whole data set, look at all of the commonly prescribed drugs. I think they had a cutoff that it had to have at least 1,000 or 10,000 prescriptions in the data set. Look at all the commonly prescribed drugs. And we know what those drugs are prescribed for. So we're going to match that to people who have the same health makeup as best you can, the same conditions, but aren't taking that drug. In which case, do the people taking the drug have lower all-cause mortality? In other words, their risk of dying is reduced. There were only I think it was 15 or 16 drugs out of the whole list of prescription drugs in the UK. There were only 15 or 16 that came out. Several of them matched up with drugs that have been shown to increase lifespan in mice through this thing called the interventions testing program. One is a whole bunch of estrogens. So we talked about the hormone replacement therapy. I found that just fascinating. A whole bunch of different estradiols in women were associated with lower all-cause mortality versus the women who weren't taking them. In mice, 17 alpha estradiol and another one, estriol, have both been shown to increase lifespan Interestingly, in mice, it's a male-specific effect. We don't understand that. In the UK Biobank, of course, it was all women taking these things.
Well, isn't estrogen is changed to testosterone in the body as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they looked at testosterone in this study, and no one has done a testosterone lifespan study in mice. That's why I say we don't have the data.
Yeah, but if you're saying the mice, it was males that it showed the increase in mortality, reduction in
increased lifespan.
Increased lifespan.
Yes. Could it have been an estrogen or a testosterone effect?
Could the estrogen have been converted to testosterone in their bodies?
I think so, but I don't know that they looked at testosterone levels. I don't think the biosynthetic pathways will run that direction from 17-alpha estradiol, but I could be wrong. So I don't know the answer to that. And now there are some men taking 17-alpha estradiol based on this mouse study. So again, this is sort of the world as it exists today. Having said that, I found it fascinating that there was this overlap. So estriol, estradiols were in that set. Another class of drugs, though, that came out were these SGLT2 inhibitors. So they have been shown to increase lifespan in mice. And what these drugs do is they basically affect a receptor in your kidney that takes glucose back up. So if you take the drug, you pee out more glucose. That's essentially all they do, as far as we know. That's thought to be the mechanism in mice. And so the question is, and it's approved diabetes drug, also now growing evidence for benefits in terms of kidney function and maybe other conditions like cardiovascular disease. So weak, but some evidence that it could be an aging drug in people. So because I like to try these things and it seemed like a good bet, and my glucose is not optimal. It never has been, even before I cleaned up my diet. But I'm not pre-diabetic. I've always sort of been like on the border, just based on the HbA1c and fasting glucose, which are not great markers of diabetes or pre-diabetes. So anyways, my fasting glucose and A1C are always higher than what you would consider optimal. I kind of thought maybe I should try an SGLT2 inhibitor, just see what happens. So I went the first week on the CGM without it, and now I'm in the second week where I'm taking the SGLT2 inhibitor. And in fact, my blood glucose is about 10 to 15 units lower. Does that mean I'm going to live longer? Who knows? Do I feel anything? No. But I kind of like looking at the CGM data, and
I actually
down in the 90s.
It's
low
interesting,
90s.
No, because I think that if you're wearing the continuous glucose monitor, sometimes it's like wearing those watches that tell you how much you sleep or tell you how much you've moved.
You totally have to know yourself.
Yeah, and sometimes people just like it to see as well. It's like a good thing for them to check in with themselves as such.
Yeah, I think it goes both ways, though, because there are also people who get anxiety from those things. So you really have to know yourself. Yeah. I mean, Oura Ring is a great example. We also use Oura Ring in our clinical programs. And, it's probably somewhere between 25 and 50% of people take it off within the first month because they say that it's affecting how they sleep, because they worry about what it's going to show them in the morning. So that's not great, right? You don't want to do something that's going to create anxiety or stress for you and be counterproductive. CGM can be the same way, but it seems to be a much lower proportion of people who have the anxiety from the CGM. I'm not sure why. It's just anecdotal.
We could talk forever because there's so many factors, but I do have to let you get off. So to wrap it up, what advice do you give young people today?
I would say I've learned a lot in my 54, almost 55 years. The one thing that I think I wish I had recognized earlier is choose love, not fear. And what I mean by that is, I think you can, and I don't mean romantic love, you can kind of think of, from a human emotional perspective, basically all of our emotions fall into one category. Either it's based around love and wanting to help others and do the right thing, or we're acting out of fear. And I think I made a lot of decisions when I was younger based out of fear, like most people do. And I have completely changed my mindset, and it's actually wear this Brutus string. I put a new one on when it wears out to remind me all the time, choose love, not fear. And you don't want to always know what the right decision is, but when you can tell that you are making a decision out of fear and it's not what you would do if you were making it out of love, you will never go wrong making it out of love. So that's probably not what you expected from the longevity scientist. It's not what I would have expected from myself 10 years ago, but that's the one thing that I wish I had learned earlier.
And do you practice Buddhism?
No, this is really just to keep that forefront in my mind.
Okay. And what's the meaning of life?
I mean, it's probably the same thing. So here's what I would say. Again, this sounds sort of corny, but, and I don't know if this is true for everybody. I think for me, and I think this is probably true for the vast majority of people, the thing that is most likely to bring you joy is doing something for someone else without expecting anything in return. So do that. It's that simple.
Matt, has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you.